Hello my friends, before we start the story, I recommend using your headphones, then relax and live as if you are the hero of the story. I hope you finish the story to the end. Let's go. I knew the dangers. The ocean was as much an enemy as the island, maybe worse. I had no idea what lay beyond the reef, what currents might drag me further out, or if the raft would even hold together long enough for me to make it anywhere. But the alternative was staying here, letting the island take me piece by piece until I forgot who I was entirely. I had made up my mind. I would leave at dawn. That night, I built a final fire, not for warmth but for light. I sat by the flames, staring into the flickering embers, my thoughts racing. The island seemed quieter than ever, as if it sensed what I was about to do. The jungle was still, the wind barely a whisper. It almost felt like a ceasefire, the calm before the storm. But the unease lingered. I knew the island wouldn't let me go easily. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, listening to the distant crash of waves, feeling the pull of the ocean and the weight of the island's gaze on me. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and impenetrable, as if the island was watching, waiting for me to make my move. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was already by the raft, ready to push off. My heart pounded in my chest as I waded into the water, feeling the icy grip of the ocean around my legs. The raft bobbed in the surf, unsteady but holding together. I climbed aboard, taking a deep breath as I pushed off from the shore with a long piece of driftwood. The island seemed to watch me go, its cliffs looming in the distance as I paddled out beyond the breakers. The current was stronger than I had anticipated, pulling me further out to sea. But I kept paddling, my arms burning with the effort, my mind focused on one thing: getting away. For the first few hours, the sea was calm. The island grew smaller behind me, shrinking into the haze of morning light. I had no idea where I was going. There were no landmarks, no signs of civilization. Just the endless expanse of water. But I didn't care. I was free. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the wind began to pick up. The waves grew choppier, splashing over the edges of the raft, soaking my clothes. I used the driftwood to steer, but it was becoming harder to keep control. The wind tugged at the makeshift sail, and the current was pulling me further off course. The horizon stretched out in every direction, a vast, empty void. There was no land in sight. I kept paddling, my muscles aching, but the raft was taking on water. The logs creaked under the strain, the vines loosening with every wave that hit. I fought to stay on course, to keep moving forward, but I could feel the raft sinking, inch by inch. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The island's voice. The same whisper I had heard in the jungle, in my own mind, now carried on the wind. "You can't leave." I froze, my hands gripping the driftwood, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. The same voice that had haunted me for days, pulling at the edges of my sanity. "You belong here." The raft lurched beneath me as a wave crashed over the side, nearly throwing me into the water. I scrambled to keep my balance, but the whisper was louder now, more insistent. "You can't run." I looked back over my shoulder, and there it was, the island. No longer a distant shape on the horizon, but looming behind me, closer than it should have been. The cliffs rose like dark sentinels, the jungle a dense, impenetrable mass. It was as if the island itself had followed me, refusing to let me escape. "You can't hide." The wind howled around me, the waves crashing higher, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the island's pull. The raft was falling apart beneath me, the vines snapping, the logs shifting. I was sinking, and the island was calling me back. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I won't go back." But the island's voice drowned out my protest, growing louder, more forceful. "You are mine." A wave hit me hard, knocking me off the raft and into the freezing water. I gasped, choking on salt water as I struggled to stay afloat. The current was too strong, pulling me under, dragging me toward the island. I thrashed, fighting against the pull, but it was no use. The island had me. In those final moments, as the water closed over my head and the island's voice consumed me, I understood. The island was never just a place. It was a living thing, feeding on those who washed up on its shores. It had claimed countless souls before me, and now it had claimed mine. I fought against the inevitable, my limbs growing heavy, my vision darkening. But as the island's voice filled my mind, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. The island had won. In the final hours of the ordeal, when hope seemed like a distant memory, the island itself played a hand in its own undoing. As the sea raged around me and my strength waned, a strange calm descended. It was as though the island had decided to let me go, its cruel game momentarily suspended. I had lost consciousness, drifting in and out of a feverish haze. The waves continued to batter me, but there was a new, persistent sound beneath the roar of the storm, a hum of machinery, the distant whine of engines. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, a final twist of the island's taunting. But as I slipped in and out of awareness, the sound grew clearer, more real. The moment of salvation came abruptly. I felt strong arms lifting me from the water, hauling me onto a solid surface. The rough hands were gentle, and the voices around me were a mixture of urgency and relief. When I opened my eyes, I was in a small cabin, surrounded by the comforting hum of an engine and the dim glow of a light bulb. My rescuers, a team of fishermen who had been patrolling the area, had found me just as my raft was breaking apart. They had seen the remnants of my struggle and managed to pull me aboard their vessel just in time. The fishermen wrapped me in warm blankets and administered first aid. I was shivering uncontrollably, my body weak from exhaustion and exposure. They spoke in soothing tones, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. They had never seen anyone in such a state, and the tales of my ordeal intrigued them. As the boat made its way back to the mainland, I was given food, water, and medical care. The transition from the desperate struggle against the island to the steady rhythm of a boat at sea was disorienting. The storm that had battered me had passed, and the ocean was calm once more, a peaceful mirror to the chaos I had endured. Recovery was slow, but I was on the mend. The fishermen took me to a hospital as soon as we reached the nearest port. The doctors there were astonished by my condition, but their care was thorough. The physical wounds were treated, but the emotional scars were more elusive. I was eventually released, and I returned to my old life with a deep sense of disconnection. The mundane realities of civilization felt surreal after the ordeal on the island. I found myself struggling to fit back into a world that seemed almost too bright, too stable after the constant danger and uncertainty I had faced. My mind was haunted by the memories of the island, the visions, the voices, the fear of losing myself. Therapy helped, but the process of reintegration was long and arduous. Each day, I fought to reclaim pieces of my old self, to remember who I was before the island had tried to take everything from me. It wasn't easy. I had to confront the inner demons that the island had awakened in me. There were days when the weight of my experience felt overwhelming, and nights when I could hear the whispers of the island in my dreams. But slowly, with the support of those around me and my own determination, I began to rebuild my life. I returned to my work, my hobbies, and the simple routines that once defined me. The memories of the island remained vivid, but they were no longer the only defining feature of my existence. I learned to appreciate the ordinary moments, sunrises, conversations, laughter, with a renewed sense of gratitude. The island had left its mark, and while it would always be a part of my past, I was determined not to let it control my future. The journey back to myself was a testament to resilience, to the human spirit's capacity to endure and heal, even after facing the most harrowing trials. In time, the island's shadow began to fade, replaced by the brightness of a life reclaimed. I had survived, and in doing so, I had found a new appreciation for the fragile, beautiful reality that I had once taken for granted. Looking back, I can hardly believe I'm still here. My name doesn't matter, but you can call me Jonas. I've always lived a predictable life, sailing the seas with merchants, fishermen, whoever needed a strong hand. I wasn't born to wealth, didn't inherit riches, but I had the ocean, and that was enough for me. I suppose if you spend enough time on the water, you become part of it. The sea shapes you. It's always changing, always unpredictable, but still comforting in its vastness. That all changed when the ship went down. It was a trade vessel, nothing remarkable. We were carrying spices and timber from a distant port, bound for a place I can't even recall anymore. I'd been on the sea long enough to know when trouble was coming, but the storm hit us harder than anyone expected. There was no warning, no time to prepare. 1 minute the sun was shining, the next, the sky opened up and swallowed us whole. The waves rose like mountains, crashing down on the deck. The wind screamed through the rigging, and the rain came in thick sheets, blinding us. We lost control of the ship within minutes. The captain, a man I trusted with my life on more than one occasion, shouted orders that no one could follow. Panic set in. Men were tossed overboard, the ship was torn apart like a toy, and then, there was nothing. I don't remember much after the ship broke. The cold water pulling me under, the deafening roar of the storm, the darkness closing in. I fought to stay above water, clinging to a piece of wreckage as the sea tried to claim me. Time blurred into an endless struggle to breathe, to stay conscious. My body was battered, my mind numb with fear and exhaustion. I don't know how long I drifted, but when I finally opened my eyes, I wasn't in the water anymore. The sand beneath me was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold ocean I'd been pulled from. I coughed up seawater, my chest burning with every breath. When I tried to move, my limbs felt like lead, weighed down by fatigue and the remnants of the storm. For a while, I just lay there, staring up at the sky. The storm had passed. The clouds were clearing, revealing a pale blue sky. It was over. But then the realization hit me. I was alone. The ship was gone, my crew was gone, and I was stranded on some deserted island in the middle of nowhere. It took hours before I could muster the strength to sit up. My body was stiff, my muscles aching from the ordeal. I scanned the shoreline, searching for any sign of life, any remnants of the wreckage. There was nothing. Just endless stretches of sand and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Fear began to creep in. I'd been in bad situations before, but nothing like this. I was on my own, with no way of knowing if anyone else had survived, or if I'd ever be found. The island seemed small, barely a speck in the vastness of the ocean. I couldn't see far past the beach, but the dense jungle beyond promised its own set of dangers. The first night was the hardest. I didn't have time to build a fire or even think about shelter. I just curled up on the sand, shivering as the temperature dropped. The island was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle in the trees or the distant cry of some unseen creature. I didn't sleep, not really. Every noise made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest as I imagined all the ways the island might try to kill me before morning. When the sun finally rose, I knew I couldn't stay like this. If I was going to survive, I had to find food, water, and shelter. The despair I felt was overwhelming, but there was something else, too, something deeper. A determination to keep going, to fight, even when the odds seemed impossible. The first challenge was water. My throat was dry, my lips cracked from the salt and sun. I couldn't survive long without fresh water, and I had no idea where to find it. There were no streams, no rivers that I could see from the beach. My only option was to venture into the jungle, but that idea terrified me. Who knew what kind of animals or dangers lurked in the shadows? But I didn't have a choice. I stood at the edge of the jungle, the thick undergrowth almost daring me to enter. The trees were tall, their branches weaving together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped into the unknown. The jungle was alive with sound. Birds called out from the treetops, their cries echoing through the dense foliage. Insects buzzed around me, their wings creating a constant hum. Every step I took was slow, deliberate, my eyes scanning for anything that might be dangerous. My only weapon was a makeshift club, a piece of driftwood I'd found on the beach, but it didn't feel like much protection against the wild. I walked for what felt like hours, the heat and humidity sapping my energy. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. There were no landmarks, nothing to guide me. Just trees, vines, and the occasional burst of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I was on the verge of giving up when I heard it, the faint trickle of water. My heart leapt in my chest. I pushed forward, my pace quickening as the sound grew louder. And then I saw it, a small stream, barely more than a trickle, but it was fresh water, and that was all that mattered. I fell to my knees, cupping my hands in the cool water and drinking deeply. It was the most refreshing thing I'd ever tasted. With water secured, I felt a small surge of hope. Maybe I could survive this after all. But there was still so much more to do. Food was the next priority. I hadn't eaten since the shipwreck, and my stomach was starting to cramp from hunger. The island didn't seem to have much in the way of edible plants, and I had no idea what was safe to eat. But I knew the sea would provide. It always had. I made my way back to the beach, determined to find something to catch fish with. The wreckage had left very little behind, but I managed to scavenge some scraps of wood and debris that could be useful. With a bit of ingenuity, I fashioned a crude spear from a sharp piece of metal I found half buried in the sand. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Fishing took patience, something I wasn't sure I had much of at the time. I waded out into the shallow water, spear in hand, and waited. The sun beat down on me, the salt stung my eyes, and every missed thrust of the spear only deepened my frustration. But I couldn't afford to give up. Hours passed before I finally managed to skewer a small fish. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. That night I built my first fire. It took forever to get the flames going, but when they finally caught, the warmth and light gave me a small sense of comfort. I cooked the fish over the fire, savoring every bite, even though it tasted of smoke and salt. It wasn't a feast, but it was survival. The days blurred together after that. Each one was a battle to stay alive. I built a simple shelter from palm leaves and driftwood, something to protect me from the rain and the relentless sun. It wasn't much, but it kept me dry, at least most of the time. The jungle was full of threats, and I learned quickly that I wasn't the only predator on the island. On more than one occasion, I heard the low growl of something large in the distance, unseen but close enough to send a chill down my spine. I never saw what it was, but I knew it was watching me. I could feel it. And then there were the nights. The nights were the worst. It's strange how the mind works when it's alone, truly alone. At first, it was just the fear of being eaten by some wild animal. But as time went on, something else began to creep in. The silence became unbearable, the isolation maddening. I'd always been a solitary person by nature, but this was different. There was no escape from it, no one to talk to, no one to even acknowledge that I was alive. I started talking to myself, just to hear a voice, any voice, even if it was my own. Memories from my past started to surface, unbidden and unwanted. Old regrets, mistakes I had long since buried. I had nothing to distract myself from them, nothing to fill the endless hours of solitude. I thought about the people I'd lost, the ones I'd pushed away. In the stillness of the island, they came back to haunt me. Some nights, I would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, and wonder if anyone even knew I was out here. Would anyone come looking for me? Did anyone care? Or was I already forgotten, just another lost sailor swallowed by the sea? That's when the despair would hit the hardest. In those moments, I felt like giving up. I'd sit on the beach, watching the horizon, and wonder if it would be easier to just walk into the ocean and let it take me. But something always held me back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just that primal instinct to survive, to keep going no matter what. Whatever it was, it kept me on the island, kept me fighting, even when I wanted to give in. There were days when I felt like I was getting stronger, like I was beginning to understand this new life. My body was leaner, tougher. I knew where to find food and water, how to catch fish more efficiently, and which parts of the jungle to avoid. I'd built a more solid shelter by then, something that actually resembled a home, if you could call it that. A hut made of woven palm fronds and branches, with a roof to keep the rain out, and a small pit for a fire. I began to fall into a kind of rhythm. Every day I'd wake up, check my traps, gather food, and work on improving my shelter. But there was always a part of me that resisted the routine. Something in me refused to accept that this was my life now, that I was stranded on this island, likely for good. I never stopped scanning the horizon, hoping against hope to see a ship. Some days I'd swear I saw something, a dark shape in the distance, a flash of light on the water. I'd run to the highest point of the beach, shouting, waving my arms, desperate to be seen. But it was always a trick of the light, my mind playing cruel games. The longer I stayed on the island, the more I began to notice the small things. The island wasn't as quiet as it had seemed at first. Life was everywhere, hidden in the details. Birds fluttered through the trees, their bright feathers a splash of color against the green. Lizards scurried across the rocks, blending into the landscape so perfectly that you'd only see them when they moved. And then there were the noises, the distant calls, the rustling of leaves, the splash of something in the water at night. Most of the time, I was too busy surviving to think much of it. But there were moments when I'd stop and just listen, and I'd feel like I was being watched. I wasn't alone on this island. I knew that now. It was during one of those nights, while I sat by the fire, that I first heard the sound, low, guttural, coming from the jungle. It wasn't the birds or the wind or the usual background noise. It was something different, something big. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't a roar or a growl, exactly, but something in between, a deep, rumbling noise that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my spear, the same one I'd used to fish with all those days ago, and stood up slowly, backing toward my shelter. I scanned the tree line, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the flickering light of the fire. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just silence. And then movement, a shadow shifting between the trees, too fast to make out any details, but large enough that I knew it wasn't one of the smaller creatures I'd seen during the day. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, spear in hand, my eyes never leaving the edge of the jungle. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly, and it wasn't afraid of me. When morning finally came, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. In the daylight, everything seemed safer, less threatening. But the memory of the noise, of the shadow, stayed with me. I needed better defenses. For the next few days, I worked harder than I ever had before. I built a proper wall around my shelter, tall stakes driven into the ground, sharpened to points at the top. It wasn't perfect, but it would slow down anything trying to get in. I also started keeping the fire going at all times, even during the day. The smoke might attract attention from any passing ships, but more importantly, it kept the jungle creatures at bay. Or at least, that's what I hoped. Despite the fear that gnawed at me, there was also a strange kind of exhilaration. I'd never felt so alive, so aware of every sound, every movement. I was always on edge, always ready for the next threat. But there was something else, too, something deeper. I started to realize that the island was changing me. The longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was becoming part of it. My old life, the ship, the crew, it all seemed so distant now, like it had happened to someone else. And then, one day, something changed. I'd been out gathering fruit when I stumbled upon something I hadn't seen before. A trail, narrow and overgrown, but unmistakable. It wound through the jungle, disappearing into the dense foliage. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't the first person to set foot on this island. There had been others. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd thought I was alone, that this island was untouched by human hands. But now I wasn't so sure. Who had made the trail? And where did it lead? I hesitated for a long time, standing at the edge of the trail, my mind racing with questions. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn back, to return to the safety of my shelter. But something else, something deeper, urged me to follow it. Curiosity won out. The trail was rough, barely visible in some places, but I followed it as best I could. The jungle seemed different here, denser, darker, as though the trees were closing in around me. My footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of leaves and moss underfoot. The air was thick, humid, and every now and then, I'd hear a distant rustle or snap of a branch, reminding me that I wasn't alone. After what felt like hours, I came to a clearing. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just more trees, more jungle. But then I saw it. A structure, half hidden by vines and overgrowth. It was small, barely more than a shack, but clearly man-made. My heart raced as I approached it, my mind racing with questions. Who had built it? Was someone still living here? And more importantly, were they friendly? I stood at the entrance for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, the wood rotting from years of exposure to the elements. I pushed it open slowly, my spear ready in case of any surprises. Inside, the shack was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tools, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here in years. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. On the far wall, scrawled in dark, uneven letters, were the words, "They watch." I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who were they? The animals? Something else? And why had the person who wrote it felt the need to warn others? Suddenly, the island didn't feel so empty anymore. I left the shack quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The jungle seemed darker, more oppressive as I made my way back to my shelter. Every sound made me jump, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. By the time I reached the safety of my fire, I was drenched in sweat, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. The island had secrets. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know what they were. After that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the noises from the jungle, or the occasional shadow moving in the trees. It was something deeper, something primal. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the hair on the back of my neck stood up when I walked too close to the edge of the jungle. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, it was watching me. The days began to blur together, each one a battle between my fear and my need to survive. I still hunted, still fished, still gathered fruit, but my mind was constantly on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was stalking me, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as I sat by the fire, I heard the sound again, that low, guttural noise from deep within the jungle. Only this time, it was closer. Much closer. I gripped my spear, my hands shaking as I listened to the sound grow louder, moving closer to my shelter. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. And then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, I saw it. Two glowing eyes, watching me from the darkness. My blood ran cold. For a moment, I was paralyzed, staring into those glowing eyes as they floated just beyond the reach of the fire's light. My grip on the spear tightened, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was out there, whatever had been watching me all this time, wasn't just some curious animal. It was something far worse. The eyes didn't move. They just watched, unblinking, as if assessing me. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the ground, but the eyes remained steady, locked on me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it human? Some kind of predator? Or something else entirely, something I couldn't even comprehend? I took a step back toward the fire, feeling the warmth at my back, trying to convince myself that as long as I stayed close to it, I would be safe. But the eyes didn't flinch. If anything, they seemed almost amused by my fear, like I was just a part of the island's endless game, and it was toying with me. My heart pounded in my chest, the silence between us thick with tension. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the eyes blinked out, swallowed by the darkness. The jungle returned to its usual symphony of sounds, crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of birds, but something had shifted. I was no longer an intruder on this island, a survivor clinging to life. Now, I was the prey, being hunted. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning as high as I could, the flames casting a small, fragile bubble of light around my shelter. I sat there, my spear resting across my knees, eyes fixed on the edge of the jungle, waiting for those eyes to reappear. But they never did. By morning, I was exhausted, but alive. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I barely ventured from my shelter, too afraid of what might be lurking in the trees. My routine, so carefully built over the past weeks, fell apart. I stopped fishing, stopped gathering fruit, and spent most of my time reinforcing the walls of my shelter, as if a few more branches and leaves could protect me from whatever was out there. I couldn't get the glowing eyes out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Every shadow in the trees, every rustle of leaves felt like a prelude to another encounter. And the worst part was, I had no idea what it was. There was something almost supernatural about it, something that defied the usual laws of nature. No animal I'd ever encountered had eyes like that. And the way it had just stood there, watching, as if it knew me, it was like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. One afternoon, after days of hiding, I forced myself to leave the shelter. My food stores were running low, and the constant fear was driving me mad. I needed to move, to do something, anything, to remind myself that I was still alive. I grabbed my spear and headed toward the beach, figuring I could try my luck with the fish again. The ocean, at least, felt safer than the jungle. The sun was hot overhead, and for the first time in what felt like days, I felt a small sense of peace as I waded into the water. The waves lapped against my legs, the salt water cool against my skin. I focused on the task at hand, trying to push all thoughts of the glowing eyes out of my mind. I stood still, spear poised, waiting for a fish to swim close enough. Hours passed, and I managed to catch a few small fish, enough to keep me going for another day. I sat on the beach afterward, cleaning the fish and trying to enjoy the small victory. But the peace was fleeting. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand, that familiar sense of unease returned. I glanced back toward the jungle. The trees loomed dark and forbidding, the thick canopy casting an eerie glow as the light faded. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew better. The island had secrets that were far older and darker than I could understand. As I made my way back to the shelter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. My skin prickled with the awareness of unseen eyes on me. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I picked up my pace, my breath quickening as I reached the edge of the jungle. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly I turned, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The jungle was dense, the shadows deep, but there, just at the edge of my vision, I saw it. The eyes. Glowing in the darkness, watching me. But this time, they were moving, slowly and deliberately, creeping closer. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the forest floor as I sprinted toward my shelter. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear something crashing through the undergrowth behind me. I burst into the clearing where my shelter stood, my breath ragged and my legs burning from the sprint. I dove inside, slamming the door shut behind me and bracing it with everything I had, stones, debris, whatever I could find. My heart raced, my entire body trembling with adrenaline. Outside, the jungle had fallen eerily silent again, but I knew it was out there. I could feel it. I kept the fire going all night, the flames casting wild shadows on the walls of my shelter. Every creak, every snap of a branch sent me into a panic, my spear clutched tightly in my hands. But nothing came. The next morning, I ventured out cautiously, the memory of the night still fresh in my mind. The beach was calm, the waves gently lapping at the shore, as if nothing had happened. But the jungle was different. I could feel it watching me, the eyes hidden just out of sight, waiting for the next opportunity. Whatever it was biding its time, and that terrified me. I spent the next few days reinforcing my shelter even more, adding layers of defense around it. I set traps around the perimeter, crude but effective, pits lined with sharpened sticks, tripwires attached to deadfall traps. Anything to give me an edge, to feel like I had some control over the situation. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. The days passed slowly, each one filled with the same routine: gathering food, checking my traps, reinforcing my shelter. But the fear never left me. Every night, I sat by the fire, waiting for the eyes to appear again. And every night they stayed hidden, just out of reach, always watching but never attacking. It wasn't until the full moon that things changed. I'd been restless all day, the tension building in my chest as the sun set and the sky turned dark. The air felt thick, electric, as if the island itself was holding its breath. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm my racing mind. But the fear was there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. And then I heard it again, the growl. But this time, it wasn't alone. From the jungle came a chorus of growls, low and menacing, surrounding me on all sides. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, spear in hand, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The fire crackled, the only source of light in the oppressive darkness, but beyond its reach, the jungle was alive with movement. Then, from the trees, the eyes appeared. Not one pair, but many. Dozens of them, glowing in the dark, circling me. I backed up slowly, my spear raised, trying to keep the fire between me and whatever was out there. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this it? Was this how it would end? The growls grew louder, more insistent, as the eyes moved closer, circling the perimeter of my shelter. I could hear their footsteps now, heavy, deliberate, as they closed in on me. And then, just as I thought they would pounce, they stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The jungle, the eyes, the growls, everything fell silent. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling with fear and adrenaline. I stood there, spear raised, waiting for the attack. But it never came. Instead, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a chill down my spine. They were spoken in a low, gravelly voice, but they were unmistakably human. I scanned the darkness, trying to find the source, but all I could see were the eyes, watching me, unblinking. "You're not welcome here." The voice came again, closer this time. The voice echoed in the darkness, low and guttural, but unmistakably human. I spun in circles, my spear trembling in my hands as I tried to pinpoint its source. The glowing eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, eerily calm in contrast to the panic rising in my chest. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice cracking as I strained to sound braver than I felt. "Show yourself!" But the voice didn't respond right away. Instead, there was silence, heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and my own ragged breathing. The eyes stayed just at the edge of the light, like a wall of predators held back by some invisible barrier. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited for the next move, for something, anything, to happen. Then, without warning, the fire flickered. It sputtered, the flame shrinking as if an unseen hand had snuffed out most of its oxygen. I jumped, my pulse quickening, but I couldn't take my eyes off the jungle. The fire was dying, and with it, my only defense against the things lurking in the shadows. "You've disturbed the island," the voice said again, closer now. "It doesn't like strangers." I swallowed hard, gripping my spear so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "I didn't want to be here," I said, the words tumbling out faster than I intended. "The shipwreck, this wasn't my choice." The silence that followed was worse than any answer I could have received. The eyes, so many pairs of them, didn't blink, didn't move. They were waiting, as if the jungle itself was alive, deciding what to do with me. The fire flickered again, barely more than embers now, casting long shadows that twisted and danced in the faint light. "You should have left," the voice whispered. It was so close, I could almost feel the breath on my neck. I whipped around, spear raised, but there was no one there. Just the jungle, dark and impenetrable. I began to say, but my voice failed me. What could I say? What did it want? There was no escaping the island. I couldn't swim to another shore, and no ship had appeared to rescue me. I was trapped, and now I was learning that maybe I wasn't even supposed to survive here at all. Suddenly, the fire went out. Completely. The light died, and in an instant, I was plunged into darkness. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned in frantic circles, the night closing in around me. The only thing left was the glowing eyes, so many of them, now moving closer, their soft luminescence piercing through the pitch-black jungle. I backed up toward my shelter, my feet stumbling over the rough ground. My entire body shook with fear as the growls returned, louder, more guttural than before. It wasn't just one creature anymore, it was a pack. And they were coming for me. In the chaos of it all, a thought shot through my mind, this is it. This is how I die. Then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the trees. At first, I thought it was another one of the creatures, part of the nightmare closing in around me. But as it stepped into the clearing, I saw it wasn't an animal. It was a man, or at least, it had the shape of one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were tattered rags, blending into the shadows of the jungle. His eyes were glowing, just like the others. The man, if that's what he was, stepped forward, his bare feet silent on the ground. His gaze fixed on me, unblinking, and the creatures around us stilled. For a moment, everything was quiet, as if the island itself was holding its breath. "You've trespassed on sacred ground," he said, his voice cold and flat, devoid of emotion. "The island has claimed you." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could barely think, let alone argue. What was this? Who was he? My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't seem to form a coherent thought. All I could do was stare at him, at the way the jungle seemed to bend around him, like he was part of it. "I don't want any trouble," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to survive." The man tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You don't belong here," he said. "But now you're part of it." Before I could respond, he raised his hand, and the growls erupted again. The creatures, whatever they were, began to move, their glowing eyes shifting as they closed in. My pulse quickened, panic surging through me as I realized that this was it. I wasn't going to make it through the night. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the creatures stopped. The man lowered his hand, his expression unreadable. The eyes, still glowing, faded back into the jungle, disappearing one by one. The growls died away, leaving only the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. I stood there, trembling, my spear still raised but useless. The man, this strange figure who seemed to command the island's creatures, took a step closer, his face now inches from mine. His glowing eyes bored into me, and for a moment I felt like he could see straight into my soul, pulling apart everything I'd been trying to keep together. "The island will test you," he said softly, almost as if it were a warning. "If you survive, you may find a way to leave. But if you don't..." His voice trailed off, and he smiled, a cold, empty smile that made my blood run cold. Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the jungle, swallowed by the darkness. I stood there, frozen, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The island would test me? What did that even mean? When the jungle was silent again, I collapsed to the ground, my legs giving out beneath me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I'd faced death before, or at least I thought I had. But this was different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something much bigger going on, something I didn't understand. The island had plans for me, and I had no idea what they were. I spent the rest of the night in my shelter, huddled by the cold ashes of my fire, too shaken to sleep. My mind replayed the encounter over and over again, trying to make sense of it. Who was that man? What were those creatures? And why had they spared me? By morning, I had no answers. Only more questions. The next few days were a blur. I didn't venture far from my shelter, still too afraid of what might be waiting for me in the jungle. But nothing happened. No eyes, no growls, no sign of the man or his creatures. It was almost as if the island had gone back to normal, as if it was giving me space to think, to decide what to do next. But I knew better. I knew the island was watching, waiting. I spent hours sitting on the beach, staring out at the endless horizon. The ocean stretched out in all directions, vast and empty, and with each passing day, the hope of rescue grew dimmer. I was truly alone. Or, at least, alone with whatever the island had in store for me. As the days passed, I began to notice changes. The air felt different, heavier, as if something was pressing down on the island. The creatures I'd seen before, the birds, the lizards, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, one night it did. I was lying in my shelter, staring up at the thatched roof, when I heard a noise. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling, like the wind moving through the trees. But then it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Many of them. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. Grabbing my spear, I moved to the door of my shelter and peered out into the night. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a pale, eerie glow, and there, just at the edge of the trees, I saw them. The glowing eyes. But this time, they weren't watching. They were moving. And they were coming straight for me. I froze as the glowing eyes advanced, their slow, deliberate movements sending a fresh wave of terror through me. There was no escape this time, no hiding in the shelter and hoping the night would pass without incident. They were coming for me, and I didn't know why, or what they wanted. The air was thick with tension, as if the island itself was waiting for my next move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon everything and flee into the jungle, but I knew better. There was no outrunning them. Whatever these creatures were, they were far more at home in this dark, twisted place than I could ever hope to be. I gripped my spear tightly, my knuckles white. My mind raced, searching for options, for some way out of this nightmare, but nothing came. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no point in delaying the inevitable. They had found me. Then, through the growing fear, something strange happened. As I stared at the advancing eyes, a bizarre calm washed over me, like a flicker of resignation. I didn't know why, but a part of me accepted that there was nothing more I could do. I had fought for so long to survive, against the elements, against my own mind, and now, it seemed, I had reached the end. But what was this end? Who were these creatures that seemed to emerge from the shadows of the island itself? And why had they waited so long to make their move? I stepped out of the shelter, the cool night air prickling my skin. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and dance as the eyes closed in. I raised my spear, not in defense, but in acknowledgement. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I wasn't going to cower. "Come on, then," I muttered under my breath, my voice barely audible. "Let's get this over with." But the creatures didn't attack. Instead, they stopped, just at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on me, unblinking. They stood there in eerie silence, like a pack of predators sizing up their prey, but not yet ready to pounce. My heart pounded in my chest, each second stretching out into an eternity as I waited for them to make their move. And then, out of the jungle, the figure appeared again. The man, if he was a man, stepped forward, his gaunt frame emerging from the shadows like something born from the island itself. His glowing eyes locked onto mine, and the faintest hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. He was different this time, more solid, more present, as if the island had given him form and purpose. He was no longer a mere apparition, no longer part of the background. He was here, in the flesh, and he had come for me. "You've passed the first test," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But the island isn't finished with you yet." I stared at him, confusion and fear battling for control of my thoughts. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice raw from days of screaming at the jungle, at the sky, at my own isolation. What is this place? Why won't you just leave me alone? The man tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. This island, he said, his voice almost reverent, isn't like any other. It is alive. It has rules, laws that you cannot comprehend. And you are an intruder. But the island has decided to test you, to see if you are worthy. Worthy of what? I demanded, the frustration boiling over. I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to survive, to get off this place. The man's smile widened, cold and empty. Survival isn't enough. You must understand the island. You must become part of it. A chill ran through me at his words. Become part of it? What did that even mean? I had been struggling every day just to stay alive, to find food, water, and shelter. I had fought off wild animals, battled my own demons of loneliness and fear, and now this twisted game? It was too much. The man stepped closer, and I instinctively raised the spear again, though I knew it would do no good. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes boring into mine. The island tests all who come here, he said. Some fail. Some disappear. But some are chosen. If you want to survive, you will need to prove yourself, to embrace what the island asks of you. And what does it ask? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the creatures that surrounded us, their glowing eyes still fixed on me. These are its protectors, he said. Its guardians. They were once like you, lost, stranded, alone. But they found their way. They became part of the island, and now they serve its will. I stared at the creatures, my skin crawling with horror at the thought. They were once human? The idea was so monstrous, so incomprehensible, that I couldn't fully process it. Was that my fate? To be consumed by the island, to become one of its mindless guardians? I won't let that happen, I said, my voice trembling with fear and defiance. I'll find a way off this island. I'll escape. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet amusement. There is no escape, he said simply. Not in the way you think. The only way off the island is to understand it. To become one with it. Only then will you be free. I shook my head, backing away from him. No, I muttered, panic rising in my chest. No, I won't do it. But the man only watched, his eyes gleaming with something almost like pity. The island will test you again, he said. It will push you to your limits. And when the time comes, you will make a choice. But know this, not all who resist survive. With that, he stepped back into the shadows, his form dissolving into the jungle as if he had never been there at all. The creatures, too, began to retreat, their glowing eyes fading into the darkness one by one. Soon, the clearing was empty, the oppressive silence returning as if the encounter had been nothing more than a dream. But I knew it was real. Every word he had said, every threat he had implied, hung heavy in the air around me. The island wasn't just testing my survival skills, it was testing my soul, my will to resist or submit. And I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. I sat down in the clearing, my hands trembling as I clutched the spear to my chest. The jungle was quiet again, the creatures gone, but I could feel their presence lingering, watching from the shadows. The island was alive, and it was waiting for me to make my next move. In the days that followed, I pushed myself harder than ever before. I ventured deeper into the jungle, further from the safety of my shelter, in search of food, water, and answers. But everywhere I went, I felt the island pressing in on me, watching, waiting for me to break. The man's words echoed in my mind, you will make a choice. But what choice? To give in? To let the island consume me, turn me into one of its guardians? Or to keep fighting, to hold on to the last shred of my humanity, and hope that somehow, I could find a way out? The line between sanity and madness blurred with each passing day. The loneliness, the fear, the constant sense of being watched, it gnawed at my mind, eroding my sense of self. I caught glimpses of things in the trees, shapes that weren't there, whispers on the wind that spoke my name. Sometimes I saw the glowing eyes again, just for a moment, before they disappeared into the shadows. One night, as I sat by a small fire, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart raced as I grabbed my spear, expecting the man or his creatures. But when I turned, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, half hidden in shadow. It was human, but not like the man I had seen before. This figure was broken, its body twisted and deformed, as if it had been reshaped by the island itself. Its eyes, dim, flickering, almost lifeless, stared at me with a hollow emptiness that chilled me to the core. It took a shuddering step forward, and I saw its face. It was my face. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My own face stared back at me, twisted and hollow, like a grotesque reflection warped by some sick, nightmarish force. The firelight flickered across its features, my features, gaunt, pale, with eyes sunken deep into my skull. It was as if the island had taken everything I feared I might become and given it form, right there in front of me. My spear slipped from my hands and hit the ground with a soft thud, but I didn't reach for it. My limbs felt numb, useless, as the figure took another staggering step toward me, its feet dragging through the dirt. The hollow version of myself moved like it was barely alive, each step laborious, as though it was held together by the barest thread of existence. And yet it didn't stop. I wanted to scream, to demand it stay away, but the words lodged in my throat. What was happening to me? Had I finally lost my mind? Was this the island's final test, to confront my own decayed reflection and be consumed by it? I tried to blink, to shake myself free from the terror, but it was no use. The figure was still there, inching closer. When it reached the edge of the firelight, the figure stopped, its head tilting slightly, as if examining me with a cold curiosity. Its mouth opened, my mouth, and a low, rattling sound escaped, like air forced through lungs that hadn't drawn breath in ages. It wasn't quite a voice. It was the sound of something broken, something that had forgotten how to be human. And then it spoke. "Help me!" The voice was weak, distorted, barely a whisper, but it was mine. It was as if my own voice had been hollowed out, stripped of everything that made it whole. The sound sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, my body shaking as I stared into those empty, dead eyes. "Help me!" it said again, the plea barely audible over the crackle of the fire. The figure's head twitched, its body swaying unnaturally, as though it might collapse at any moment. "Please!" I forced myself to move, to speak, though my voice came out as a hoarse croak. What are you?" The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it took another step forward, its hands twitching at its sides. The skin on its fingers, my fingers, was stretched tight, too tight, like it was barely holding the bones in place. I backed up, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts, but the figure followed, its eyes never leaving mine. "I'm you," it rasped, its voice cracking as it struggled to form the words. "I'm what's left." "What do you mean?" I whispered, though deep down I knew. I knew exactly what it meant. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque approximation of a smile. My smile. But wrong, so horribly wrong. "You've been here too long. The island, it changes. It makes you part of it. I didn't fight. I didn't resist." Its words sent a jolt of fear through me, more intense than anything I had felt since arriving on the island. This wasn't just a hallucination, wasn't just some trick of my mind. This was real, or at least, as real as the island's twisted reality could be. The island had taken something from me, was still taking something from me, and now, it was showing me what I could become if I let it. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "No, that's not me. I'm not like you." The figure's head jerked again, its eyes narrowing. "Not yet." The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse under the weight of them. Not yet. The island wasn't done with me. It was still testing me, still pushing me towards some unseen edge, and if I didn't fight, if I didn't resist with everything I had, I would end up like the thing standing in front of me. Hollow. Empty. A shell. No! I shouted this time, my fear igniting into a spark of defiance. I'm not you! I won't let this island take me! The figure didn't flinch. It simply stood there, watching, its expression unchanged. Then, slowly, it reached out a hand, my hand, toward me. It's already started, it whispered. You can feel it, can't you? The island, it's in your mind. In your blood. I shook my head violently, backing away further. No. I'm going to get off this island. I'm going to survive. The figure's smile twisted into something darker, more sinister. There's no escape. There's only the island. You'll see. I couldn't take it anymore. My fear and anger boiled over, and before I knew what I was doing, I lunged forward, grabbing the spear from the ground and thrusting it toward the figure. I didn't care if it was real or not, I just needed it to be gone, to disappear, to leave me alone. The spear struck the figure's chest, but instead of resistance, there was nothing. No solid impact, no sound of flesh tearing. The spear passed right through it, as though the figure was made of smoke. I stumbled, nearly falling as the spear hit the ground behind it, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, watching, that same empty smile on its face. You can't fight it, it said, its voice softer now, almost pitying. The island, it always wins. I staggered back, dropping the spear as I stared at the figure, my mind spinning. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But as the figure faded, dissolving into the night like a wisp of fog, I was left with the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, it was right. The island was inside me. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I just needed to keep moving, to keep pushing forward, away from the madness that was eating away at my mind. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination, another trick of the island, but as I moved closer, it became unmistakable. It was the sound of waves crashing against the shore. The ocean. I hadn't been near the coast since the day I'd first washed up on the island, half drowned and delirious. In my desperation to survive, I had moved inland, away from the endless stretch of water that reminded me of how utterly alone I was. But now, something was pulling me back, guiding me toward the sea as though it held the answers I'd been searching for. The trees thinned as I approached the beach, and the ground beneath my feet turned to sand. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting an eerie glow across the shore. The waves lapped gently at the sand, the sound soothing in its regularity, like the heartbeat of the island itself. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the vastness of the ocean stretching out before me, a black void that seemed to swallow the horizon. But I wasn't alone. At first I thought it was just another trick of the light, a shadow, or a rock out in the surf, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly. A figure, standing waist-deep in the water, its back to me. My heart leapt into my throat. The figure was still, unmoving, as the waves broke around it, as though it had been standing there for hours, days, maybe even longer. I took a step forward, my feet sinking into the wet sand. The figure remained motionless, its silhouette stark against the shimmering water. My mind raced, torn between fear and curiosity. Was this another apparition, another ghost conjured by the island? Or was it something more? A survivor, perhaps, someone else who had been trapped here, lost, just like me? Hey! I called out, my voice cracking from disuse. The sound seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the endless crash of the waves. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. Hey! I called again, louder this time. Still, no response. The figure remained standing, its back turned, as if oblivious to my presence. A chill ran down my spine as I drew nearer. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a deep, primal sense of dread that warned me to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't. Some force, whether curiosity or desperation, pulled me forward. I was only a few feet away now. The figure was tall, taller than any person I had seen, its body gaunt and elongated. It was wearing what appeared to be some kind of tattered clothing, ragged and soaked, hanging limply from its thin frame. Its skin, pale and sickly in the moonlight, seemed almost translucent, as though the water had washed away all the color from its flesh. I reached out, my hand trembling, as if to touch its shoulder, to see if it was real. But before I could make contact, the figure began to turn. Slowly, excruciatingly slowly, it pivoted in the water, its movements unnatural, as though its joints didn't quite work the way they should. The sound of creaking, cracking bones echoed faintly in the air, sending a wave of nausea through me. My hand dropped to my side as I took a step back, instinctively bracing myself for whatever I was about to see. When the figure finally faced me, I gasped in horror. Its face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque, distorted parody of human features. The eyes were sunken deep into its skull, black, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. The skin was stretched taut over the bones, so thin that I could see the contours of the skull beneath. Its mouth hung open in a perpetual grimace, as though frozen in an eternal scream. And the worst part, the part that nearly sent me running in blind terror, was that the face was my own. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. This thing, this twisted, nightmarish reflection of myself, stared at me with those hollow eyes, as though waiting for me to speak, to acknowledge its existence. But I couldn't. I couldn't find the words. Then, without warning, the figure began to move toward me. Slowly at first, its steps deliberate and unnatural, like something that hadn't walked in a long time. The water churned around it, thick and black, as though the ocean itself was recoiling from its presence. I backed away, my feet slipping in the wet sand as I tried to put distance between myself and the figure. But it kept coming, its gaze never leaving mine. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in terror. As the figure drew closer, the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I gasped, struggling for air, my vision blurring as the weight of the island itself seemed to bear down on me. I could hear its whispers now, faint, unintelligible, but growing louder with every step the figure took. "You're already dead." The thoughts slammed into my mind like a hammer, unbidden, relentless. "You're already dead. This is just the end." "No," I whispered, shaking my head, but the figure's advance didn't slow. It was almost on me now, its arms outstretched, the bony fingers reaching toward me like claws. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, its dead eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew this was what the island wanted. This was its test. To see if I would break, if I would give in and let it consume me. But I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I turned and ran. My legs finally obeyed me, propelling me forward as fast as they could through the thick sand. Behind me, I could hear the figure's distorted footsteps, slow but steady, following me up the beach, relentless in its pursuit. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every second wasted could be my last. I sprinted into the jungle, crashing through the undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The branches tore at my skin, leaving scratches and welts, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The island was alive around me, watching, waiting, and the figure, that thing, was somewhere behind me, hunting me. I burst into the clearing where my shelter stood, barely slowing down as I scrambled inside. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears as I grabbed the spear and crouched, trying to steady my breathing. The jungle was silent again, the oppressive quiet settling over the clearing like a shroud. I listened for the sound of footsteps, the rustle of leaves, anything that would tell me the figure was near, but there was nothing. Just the endless stillness. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I stayed there, crouched in the darkness, my spear clutched tightly in my hands, waiting for the figure to emerge from the jungle. But it never came. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I sank to the ground, my body trembling from the adrenaline crash. My mind raced with questions, with fear, but no answers came. As I lay there, staring up at the stars through the gaps in the shelter, a chilling thought crept into my mind, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. The island wasn't done with me yet. The days following that night became a blur of restless vigilance. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that the figure in the water had been some kind of waking nightmare, but deep down, I knew the truth. It was real. As real as the hunger gnawing at my stomach, as real as the thick humidity that clung to every breath I took. The island had given it life. Just like it had with the hollow version of myself. This place, this nightmare, was more than just a physical landscape. It was alive in ways I couldn't fully grasp. And now, it was watching me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure's twisted reflection of my own face staring back at me, its hollow eyes gleaming with something dark and malicious. And always, in the back of my mind, was the constant whisper of the island's presence. It was like a low hum, just below the threshold of hearing, always there, always reminding me that it wasn't finished with me yet. But I had to keep moving. Had to keep fighting. If I stayed still too long, I feared the island would win. I could feel it tugging at the edges of my sanity, twisting my thoughts, bending my reality. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the trees made my heart race, made my skin prickle with cold sweat. I wasn't just surviving the island anymore. I was at war with it. I tried to occupy myself with tasks. Gathering food, reinforcing my shelter, sharpening my spear. But none of it felt like enough. The fear was a constant presence, tightening around my throat like a noose. Every time I ventured into the jungle, I felt eyes on me, though I saw no creatures, no signs of life. Just the oppressive stillness, waiting for something to happen. And then, one morning, I found the tracks. I was heading toward the river, hoping to catch some fish, when I saw them in the dirt. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, the faint outlines of claws and paws pressed into the soft ground. But as I crouched down to get a closer look, my blood ran cold. They were footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, almost obscured by the wind and the undergrowth, but they were unmistakable. The shape, the size, everything about them matched my own feet. I stared at them, my mind reeling. Had someone else survived the wreck? Was there someone else on the island, just like me? But no, there hadn't been anyone else when the ship sank. I'd been the only one who made it to shore. I was certain of it. Unless... the figure. The one I had seen in the water. The one that had my face. I rose to my feet, heart pounding, as I followed the tracks deeper into the jungle. The prints were spaced far apart, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them was moving quickly, almost running. I moved carefully, spear in hand, my senses heightened, every sound and movement making me jump. The deeper I went, the thicker the jungle became, the air growing damp and heavy. I followed the tracks for what felt like hours, losing them at times, only to pick them up again a few yards further. And then, finally, they led me to a small clearing, one I hadn't seen before. In the center of the clearing, nestled between two large rocks, was something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a structure. A crude shelter, hastily built from branches and leaves, similar to the one I had made when I first arrived on the island. But this wasn't mine. I had never been to this part of the jungle before. And yet, it was eerily familiar, almost identical to my own shelter in its construction. The same rough walls, the same shape, like a mirror image of what I had built. I stepped forward cautiously, my spear raised, as I approached the shelter. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and I had to fight the urge to turn back, to flee. But something pulled me closer, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what was happening. When I reached the entrance, I peered inside. It was dark, the interior shadowed by the dense canopy overhead, but I could make out the basic shape of the space. It was empty, save for a small pile of rocks in the center, arranged in a rough circle. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Lining the walls of the shelter, carefully placed on the ground, were bones. Human bones. They were old, bleached white by time, but unmistakably human. Skulls, rib cages, arms, legs, all arranged in neat, orderly rows, like some kind of grotesque offering to the island. My hands shook as I took a step back, my mind racing. Who had done this? Who, or what, had built this place? And why? For a long moment neither of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at each other, both of us on edge, both of us waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, I broke the silence. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. The man didn't answer right away. His eyes darted around, scanning the trees, as if expecting something to leap out at him. His body was hunched, tense, like a cornered animal ready to bolt. I tightened my grip on the spear, unsure if I was about to be attacked or if he was as terrified as I was. He swallowed, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. I don't know. His words sent a cold shiver through me. I studied him more closely in the dim moonlight, his gaunt face and hollow eyes. His skin was sunken and pale, his body emaciated as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. But what struck me most was his familiarity. I couldn't shake the eerie sense that I had seen him before, not just in passing, but intimately. His face, his posture, his very presence, it was like looking into a dark mirror. Who are you? I asked again, more insistent this time, though my own voice wavered with uncertainty. I was like you, he said, his gaze finally locking onto mine, as though he'd reached some painful conclusion. I came here, but I don't know when. I don't remember anymore. It's all gone. I took a step back, the fear twisting tighter in my gut. His eyes, they were too familiar, his voice too close to mine, like an echo. The island had shown me reflections of myself before, but this was different. He wasn't just a vision or a nightmare. He was real, standing right in front of me, and yet somehow still a part of the island's game. What do you mean, like me? I asked, trying to make sense of his cryptic words. Did you survive a wreck? Were you on my ship? The man's lips twitched, as though he wanted to smile, but couldn't remember how. His hand shook as he raised it, gesturing vaguely toward the jungle, toward the unseen horrors lurking in the shadows. I don't know, he whispered. I thought I was someone else once. But the island takes it. All of it. Piece by piece. Until you don't know who you are anymore. The despair in his voice was palpable, but there was something deeper, something darker. A knowledge that weighed on him, that had broken him in ways I couldn't yet understand. I felt a flicker of panic rise in my chest, the same panic I had felt when the figure with my face had first appeared, when the jungle had whispered to me in my own voice. But this was worse. This was the reality of what I could become. The man stepped closer, his hands still outstretched as if pleading with me. His skin was so thin it seemed to hang off his bones, as though the very life had been drained from him. The island, it wants us to forget, he said, his voice rasping with each word. It pulls at you until there's nothing left but this. I took another step back, shaking my head. No, I said firmly, more to myself than to him. I'm not like you. I can't be. You think you're different? He asked, his voice rising with a sudden, frantic intensity. You think you can beat it? Survive it? That's what I thought, too. I fought and fought, but the island, it wears you down. It takes you apart from the inside. I can get off this island, I insisted, but the conviction in my voice was faltering. The island had been testing me from the start, tearing at my wool, my sanity, but I had refused to give in. Yet now, standing before this broken version of myself, I could feel the island tightening its grip. The man was a warning, a glimpse of what I might become if I let it take control. There's no escape, he murmured. No way out. Not once you're a part of it. He reached out toward me, his fingers trembling, and I instinctively flinched, pulling back. His face contorted with something between pain and understanding. I'm sorry, he whispered, lowering his hand. I didn't mean for this to happen. I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to piece together the fragmented reality of what was happening. Was this man really me, another version of me, lost to the island's madness? Or was he a figment of my imagination, just another hallucination designed to break me? "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper. But the question wasn't meant for him anymore, it was for me. The man's face crumpled, as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. He sank to his knees in the sand, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stood there, staring down at him, feeling a strange mix of pity and terror. He was a shadow of who I was, of who I could become, and the sight of him filled me with a deep, unsettling dread. I can help you," I said weakly, though I wasn't sure how. "We can find a way out of this." He looked up at me, his eyes dull and defeated. "There's no help. No way out." The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. But before I could respond, something in the jungle stirred. The leaves rustled, the undergrowth shifted, and that familiar cold sensation of being watched crawled over my skin. The man's head snapped up, his eyes wide with sudden fear. "It's coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "What's coming?" I asked, though I already knew. "The island," he said, his voice trembling. "It knows. It's always known." I looked around, the jungle now feeling more oppressive than ever, its shadows deeper, more hostile. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the island itself was closing in on us, tightening its grip. I could hear something moving through the trees, something large, something primal. The island wasn't just watching. It was coming for us. "We have to go," I said, panic rising in my chest. But the man shook his head, his body trembling. "You can't run from it. You can't hide." I wanted to scream at him, to shake him out of his despair, but before I could say another word, the jungle around us erupted with noise. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath our feet. The air was filled with the sound of something approaching, something vast and terrifying. I turned and ran, my body moving on pure instinct. I heard the man scream behind me, a guttural, animalistic sound that echoed through the jungle, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run, to get away from whatever was coming, from whatever the island had sent to claim me. The jungle was a blur of shadows and shapes as I sprinted through the undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, that thing, crashing through the trees with a relentless, unstoppable force. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What was it? What did the island want from me? I burst through the trees and into the clearing where my shelter stood, my heart pounding in my chest. I spun around, the spear gripped tightly in my hands, waiting for whatever was chasing me to appear. But the jungle was still again, as if nothing had ever been there. The man's scream still echoed in my ears, but it was fading now, swallowed by the thick silence that settled over the clearing. I stood there, trembling, my chest heaving, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. The jungle was quiet once more, the oppressive silence weighing down on me like a lead blanket. I lowered the spear, my hands shaking, as I tried to calm my racing heart. What had I seen? What had chased me through the jungle? I didn't know anymore. I didn't know what was real and what was just another trick of the island. The man was gone. Whether he had been real, or just another figment of my mind, I couldn't say. All I knew was that I was still alive, still here. But for how much longer? The island wasn't done with me yet. I sank to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The fire had gone out, leaving me in darkness, and the jungle loomed around me, vast and unknowable. I was losing track of time, losing track of myself. How much longer could I hold on before the island took me, too? And then, as I sat there in the darkness, I realized something that chilled me to my core. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. I was afraid of what would come after. The next morning, the island was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, as if the world itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I woke up drenched in sweat, despite the cool air that drifted in from the ocean. My dreams had been full of the man, his gaunt face twisted with fear, his voice echoing in my head, "You can't run from it." The words lingered like a curse. Every nerve in my body was on edge, my senses heightened, as if I was expecting the jungle to swallow me whole at any moment. But for the first time in days, I didn't feel watched. Whatever had been stalking me, hunting me, had retreated, at least for now. Still, the unease was there, thrumming under my skin. I moved through the day on autopilot, gathering water from the stream, collecting fruit and whatever fish I could catch. It was a routine I had perfected over the long weeks, yet today it felt futile. Mechanical. Like none of it mattered anymore. The island had shown me what lay ahead if I stayed here, what it could reduce me to. The man's hollow eyes haunted me. He was what I feared most, wasn't he? Not just death, but the slow erosion of who I was until I became something unrecognizable. Until I forgot my name, my past, my very self. And the island would win. I couldn't let that happen. But what choices did I have? There was no rescue coming. No sign of other survivors. The only thing left for me was to either succumb to the island's game, or find a way to escape. That's when I remembered the boat. It was more of a raft, really, something I had started building during the early days of my time here when hope still felt like something tangible. I had found large logs on the beach and lashed them together with vines, thinking maybe I could use it to paddle out beyond the breakers, far enough to be spotted by a passing ship. But after days and weeks of failed attempts, I had abandoned the project, half buried under sand and debris. Now, the idea resurfaced in my mind with startling clarity. If I stayed on this island, the slow madness would creep in, turning me into a reflection of the broken man I had seen in the jungle. The only way to stop that was to leave, even if it meant risking my life on a raft barely sturdy enough to float. Anything was better than surrendering to the island. I went down to the beach that afternoon. The tide was low, and I could see the remains of the raft where I had left it, partially covered in sand and debris from storms that had swept through. It was in bad shape, but it wasn't beyond repair. The logs were still intact, and with some work, I could reinforce them with thicker vines, maybe even add a sail using leaves and branches. I spent the rest of the day rebuilding the raft, my hands moving with a strange sense of purpose. The sun was hot on my back, but I hardly noticed. Each lash of the vines, each knot I tied, was a small rebellion against the island. Against its pull, its insidious whispers. By sunset, I had something that might float. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. I dragged it down to the water's edge, my muscles aching with the effort. The waves lapped at the raft, as if testing it, taunting me. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the endless horizon, the water stretching out before me like a vast, indifferent force. I knew the dangers. The ocean was as much an enemy as the island, maybe worse. I had no idea what lay beyond the reef, what currents might drag me further out, or if the raft would even hold together long enough for me to make it anywhere. But the alternative was staying here, letting the island take me piece by piece until I forgot who I was entirely. I had made up my mind. I would leave at dawn. That night, I built a final fire, not for warmth but for light. I sat by the flames, staring into the flickering embers, my thoughts racing. The island seemed quieter than ever, as if it sensed what I was about to do. The jungle was still, the wind barely a whisper. It almost felt like a ceasefire, the calm before the storm. But the unease lingered. I knew the island wouldn't let me go easily. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, listening to the distant crash of waves, feeling the pull of the ocean and the weight of the island's gaze on me. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and impenetrable, as if the island was watching, waiting for me to make my move. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was already by the raft, ready to push off. My heart pounded in my chest as I waded into the water, feeling the icy grip of the ocean around my legs. The raft bobbed in the surf, unsteady but holding together. I climbed aboard, taking a deep breath as I pushed off from the shore with a long piece of driftwood. The island seemed to watch me go, its cliffs looming in the distance as I paddled out beyond the breakers. The current was stronger than I had anticipated, pulling me further out to sea. But I kept paddling, my arms burning with the effort, my mind focused on one thing: getting away. For the first few hours, the sea was calm. The island grew smaller behind me, shrinking into the haze of morning light. I had no idea where I was going. There were no landmarks, no signs of civilization. Just the endless expanse of water. But I didn't care. I was free. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the wind began to pick up. The waves grew choppier, splashing over the edges of the raft, soaking my clothes. I used the driftwood to steer, but it was becoming harder to keep control. The wind tugged at the makeshift sail, and the current was pulling me further off course. The horizon stretched out in every direction, a vast, empty void. There was no land in sight. I kept paddling, my muscles aching, but the raft was taking on water. The logs creaked under the strain, the vines loosening with every wave that hit. I fought to stay on course, to keep moving forward, but I could feel the raft sinking, inch by inch. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The island's voice. The same whisper I had heard in the jungle, in my own mind, now carried on the wind. "You can't leave." I froze, my hands gripping the driftwood, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper was faint, but it was there, unmistakable. The same voice that had haunted me for days, pulling at the edges of my sanity. "You belong here." The raft lurched beneath me as a wave crashed over the side, nearly throwing me into the water. I scrambled to keep my balance, but the whisper was louder now, more insistent. "You can't run." I looked back over my shoulder, and there it was, the island. No longer a distant shape on the horizon, but looming behind me, closer than it should have been. The cliffs rose like dark sentinels, the jungle a dense, impenetrable mass. It was as if the island itself had followed me, refusing to let me escape. "You can't hide." The wind howled around me, the waves crashing higher, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the island's pull. The raft was falling apart beneath me, the vines snapping, the logs shifting. I was sinking, and the island was calling me back. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I won't go back." But the island's voice drowned out my protest, growing louder, more forceful. "You are mine." A wave hit me hard, knocking me off the raft and into the freezing water. I gasped, choking on salt water as I struggled to stay afloat. The current was too strong, pulling me under, dragging me toward the island. I thrashed, fighting against the pull, but it was no use. The island had me. In those final moments, as the water closed over my head and the island's voice consumed me, I understood. The island was never just a place. It was a living thing, feeding on those who washed up on its shores. It had claimed countless souls before me, and now it had claimed mine. I fought against the inevitable, my limbs growing heavy, my vision darkening. But as the island's voice filled my mind, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. The island had won. In the final hours of the ordeal, when hope seemed like a distant memory, the island itself played a hand in its own undoing. As the sea raged around me and my strength waned, a strange calm descended. It was as though the island had decided to let me go, its cruel game momentarily suspended. I had lost consciousness, drifting in and out of a feverish haze. The waves continued to batter me, but there was a new, persistent sound beneath the roar of the storm, a hum of machinery, the distant whine of engines. At first, I thought it was another hallucination, a final twist of the island's taunting. But as I slipped in and out of awareness, the sound grew clearer, more real. The moment of salvation came abruptly. I felt strong arms lifting me from the water, hauling me onto a solid surface. The rough hands were gentle, and the voices around me were a mixture of urgency and relief. When I opened my eyes, I was in a small cabin, surrounded by the comforting hum of an engine and the dim glow of a light bulb. My rescuers, a team of fishermen who had been patrolling the area, had found me just as my raft was breaking apart. They had seen the remnants of my struggle and managed to pull me aboard their vessel just in time. The fishermen wrapped me in warm blankets and administered first aid. I was shivering uncontrollably, my body weak from exhaustion and exposure. They spoke in soothing tones, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. They had never seen anyone in such a state, and the tales of my ordeal intrigued them. As the boat made its way back to the mainland, I was given food, water, and medical care. The transition from the desperate struggle against the island to the steady rhythm of a boat at sea was disorienting. The storm that had battered me had passed, and the ocean was calm once more, a peaceful mirror to the chaos I had endured. Recovery was slow, but I was on the mend. The fishermen took me to a hospital as soon as we reached the nearest port. The doctors there were astonished by my condition, but their care was thorough. The physical wounds were treated, but the emotional scars were more elusive. I was eventually released, and I returned to my old life with a deep sense of disconnection. The mundane realities of civilization felt surreal after the ordeal on the island. I found myself struggling to fit back into a world that seemed almost too bright, too stable after the constant danger and uncertainty I had faced. My mind was haunted by the memories of the island, the visions, the voices, the fear of losing myself. Therapy helped, but the process of reintegration was long and arduous. Each day, I fought to reclaim pieces of my old self, to remember who I was before the island had tried to take everything from me. It wasn't easy. I had to confront the inner demons that the island had awakened in me. There were days when the weight of my experience felt overwhelming, and nights when I could hear the whispers of the island in my dreams. But slowly, with the support of those around me and my own determination, I began to rebuild my life. I returned to my work, my hobbies, and the simple routines that once defined me. The memories of the island remained vivid, but they were no longer the only defining feature of my existence. I learned to appreciate the ordinary moments, sunrises, conversations, laughter, with a renewed sense of gratitude. The island had left its mark, and while it would always be a part of my past, I was determined not to let it control my future. The journey back to myself was a testament to resilience, to the human spirit's capacity to endure and heal, even after facing the most harrowing trials. In time, the island's shadow began to fade, replaced by the brightness of a life reclaimed. I had survived, and in doing so, I had found a new appreciation for the fragile, beautiful reality that I had once taken for granted. Thank you for listening.